Okay, let's thank you everyone for joining us today, and good afternoon. Um, Thank you for joining today's colloquium that is sponsored by the Center for Data and Society. And our special guest today is Dr. Henry Buhner. Dr. Henry Buhner is currently an instructor here at Chestnut Hill College. He serves as the interim coordinator of the Global Awareness Program, the International Affairs Program, and the interim coordinator of political science. He received his BA in history at the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD in history from Temple University. Fellow Owl.
Yeah.
His interests include legal, political, and intellectual development in Anglo American history. His current book project focuses on the British jurist Lord Mansfield and the Anglo American political discourse over his life and legacy. The book will be published by University of Virginia Press, hopefully, Henry says, in 2023. Before we get started, I've learned a great deal from Henry, and just given his background in political institutions and development, he really has a way of contextualize the sheer novelty of American political institutions, particularly in a comparative and a historical perspective. So he gives me so much insight in that regard. So I really look forward to his talk today. And I'm still very much processing the 2020 election. So I'm glad that he's here to help unpack a part of that. So Dr. Henry Buhner, and his talk today is entitled Psephology, Swing, and the Election of 2020. So Henry, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for having me and sponsoring this talk. Very kind words, and I'm glad you emphasized my historical background because you're going to get a little bit of both today. I'm always about the long-term context of things. So, for those who might not know, psephology very simply is the study of elections, and that could take many different forms. In that process, you can look merely at the election results. You can look at the demographics of results and try to figure out why people voted the way they did. Psephology takes many forms. Now, we're today going to look at a particular form of psephology, and that is the idea of swing. And swing is a means by which to try to get a taste of just the sheer magnitude of people changing their votes from one election to another. And doing so in a way where we're not going to be able to ask everybody, why they changed their vote, but just get a sense of what is going on. But also the fact that between any two elections, the electorate is not always the same. It's not the same in size. It's not the same in composition. And so swing has become a means by which to at least begin the process of how to examine two elections, especially consecutive elections, although you could certainly do it over longer periods of time. And I'm going to apply it to the recent election in 2020 to do a couple of things that I hope you'll find interesting. And that's when we'll turn to the more political science side of this towards the end. Now, I do want to begin with our hero for today. I guess for a political scientist, the closest to the word hero. This is Dr. David Butler, and he is a British psephologist who is still with us at the ripe old age of 97.
Oh,
He is the inventor of swing, or at least the first to really begin a mathematical approach of dealing with it. Dr. Butler was a fellow at the Nuffield College, Oxford, very eminently suited, but also became a fixture on a lot of British and later Australian political election night coverage. And so if you're from those parts of the world, you might have seen David Butler at some point. Now, what David Butler was tasked with doing in, where he came up with his idea of swing was to explain a situation that arose out of circumstance in Great Britain in 1945, and that was that Britain had foregone its traditional electoral process and did not have an election in 1940. Just as brief, um, under the current British law, a parliament can sit for no longer than 5 years. But in 1940, in the midst of the beginning of World War II, but also because of the events surrounding the downfall of Neville Chamberlain's government, it was decided to forego elections and create a government of national unity. And that's the government that pretty much governed Britain through the course of World War II. Now, what's interesting, or not, maybe not interesting by itself, but that with the war over in Europe by April of 1945, it became kind of imperative to the national government that one of the ways that they could get back to some semblance of normalcy was to have this long-awaited election. That would be a kind of slice of freedom. This, it kind of followed the bonhomie of defeating the Nazis, and but you're still fighting Japan, but you're done fighting the Nazis. So it became kind of imperative to them to hold elections. Now, unlike the end of World War I, where what happened there, they had another government of a national government, then a government of national unity. In the election that followed World War I in 1918, it was decided that it would be a competitive, so there would be parties fighting against each other. But basically it was set up as an election of those who wanted to keep the government of unity, and then the people in the parties who didn't want to do that. It was famously known as the coupon election because they gave coupons out to the soldiers. But basically, the idea of letting the soldiers vote this method would be to allow who the prime minister was at the time, David Lloyd George, to pretty much stay in power by offering this government of national unity. Coming at the end of World War II, the conservatives, led by Winston Churchill, didn't want to go and settle into that pattern again. David Lloyd George ended up being prime minister for quite some time after that, but then got embroiled in a lot of scandals, and it broke British politics throughout the 1920s. And the conservatives as a whole, because they had experienced it in Churchill himself, which ironically enough, he was a member of the national government during World War I, but then in the 1920s will abandon the Liberal Party and switch to the Conservatives. He personally kind of was ambivalent about continuing the national government, so he insisted that any election would involve the parties going their separate ways and running a very traditional election. So Conservative versus Labor versus Liberal versus the others. Now, the one thing that is kind of lost in British history to this day, lost meaning that people know it happened, but it kind of gets lost in the explanation of things, especially with the way that, and this is true also in America, the way that Churchill's view has changed. You might find it surprising, but you see the results here. Churchill, who leads the government through World War II, on the strength of mostly conservative seats, so that's the election of 1935, ends up losing the election of 1945. So Churchill, the wartime leader, leads his party to defeat in the election of 1945, which was, to many observers, a shock result. How can, winning the war, you being the leader of that party, go from having your party win 429 seats in 1935, and even over the course of 10 years, to not only losing seats, but losing, more than half of your majority, and thus allowing the Labor Party to now become the party of government. And so people were trying to figure out how to make sense of this. One of the troubles, though, in trying to analyze this from any national perspective was, well, a lot changed in 10 years. People were born, people became old enough to vote, but you just had a war that, while not as catastrophic as wars in the past, people died. And so you had these great kind of population shifts. But also the political, the psephologists or the more generally minded political scientists, this was really a moment to really, exercise some of the theories that they had begun to develop since the beginning of the 20th century in studying elections overall. And so this provided a ripe opportunity. But they first wanted to be able to figure out how to, or where to look. And so David Butler comes up with this idea of developing the idea of swing to be able to, not perfectly, but to account for these demographic changes in a very simplistic fashion. So how to take the numbers from one election, or the outcomes at least, the voting column here, maybe not the seats so much, but the voting column, and try to identify two things essentially: a national swing. So, what is the general mood of the public? But then to be able to use that national swing and analyze it on local levels to figure out in ways why generally people voted or switched their party leader, because that's really what swing is. Why did people change their vote from one party to another? Now, just as a mode here, just to explain too, one of the other challenges between the two elections that was in the 10 years between the elections, Parliament had added 25 seats. So you also have an issue there about the configuration of Parliament. So David Butler's answer to figuring out how to do this measurement, this very simplistic measurement that would give this kind of baseline way of analyzing these changes, was famously now what's known as the Butler swing. And it's called the Butler swing because since David Butler designed or came up with this idea, others have tried to refine it, have tried to use swing in different ways to signify other things, that sometimes what the Butler swing says isn't what another swing will say. So it's all contextually driven today. But the original basic swing mechanism, the Butler swing, was simply to take half of the change in the winner's vote, the absolute value of that, plus the absolute value of the change in the loser's vote. So if I just go back a moment, you could do it as a percentage of vote. You could do it with actual votes. But essentially, since we know that the Labor Party won, you would take the winning 48 and subtract it from Labor's 38, and add that to the absolute value of Conservatives' 45 election with their 35 election outcome, and take half of that. And that would be the swing. And essentially, the swing is meant to give a general picture of the percentage of the electorate that had to move from one party to another. And that's why I write this note. Butler's swing can only be used really to analyze this between two parties. Now, in the United States, not surprising to us if I say it like this, but in the context of swing, we are primarily a two-party structure. So swing in many ways can tell us a lot about changes in general attitudes. In Great Britain, even when Butler developed this, there were two major parties, Conservative and Labor, but Labor wasn't the powerful second party it was today. When Butler developed swing, Labor was really only in its infancy of displacing the Liberal Party as the natural opposition party to the Conservatives. So what that means at very least, and that's why I wrote it in here, it's essentially a government with three notable parties and a lot of others. That's 11 seats, in a chamber of 615 is not nothing to sneeze at within itself. But Britain is a multi-party system. So Butler's swing as applied to Great Britain was a little bit of a challenge because you have more than two parties. Nevertheless, Labor would continue, especially with its victory in 1945, cemented itself as the major second party. And in a way, government since to this day has either vacillated between a Labor or Conservative party. So you can use Butler's swing, but you have to that's why other people have developed other methods to do it, because Britain is not a true two-party state. But it may be more useful to us in the United States, where we mostly have a two-party structure. So it's a very useful mechanism for us to analyze elections. But just keep that in mind, because we'll come back to this in a moment. Now, the most famous application of David Butler's swing was in academia. He will go on to kind of he's known now as the Sultan of Swing, if you kind of know old British rock music. But that's the name he's kind of settled with now. And so in academic circles, swing became, a very useful mechanism to examine elections. But on the popular front, the most popular application of swing was in what's called the swingometer, which is still a fixture in British election night broadcasting. It's also used in Canada. It's also used in Australia. It's very popular in countries that use a parliamentary form of government. And part of the reason is that the parliamentary governments rely upon the strength of a party and their majority to pretty much have the reins of all government. And I'm really shorthanding that for you. I teach whole classes on the British government. But with that said, in some ways, the swingometer becomes a nice kind of visual tool by which you could use on election night to see where the state of the parties are. And what's interesting about the swingometer is it's very simplistic, and I've shown you a couple swingometers through time. So you have the first time the swingometer was used in 1959 up here in the left corner. Then they were only measuring swing on a very small scale, very rudimentary. I provided the swingometer from the 1970 election, which is the famous off scale that in the middle of the broadcast, they realized that the swing to the conservatives was greater than they anticipated. So they had to paint that they had to add on to the swingometer in order to give, because this is before the age of digital technology. So they had to extend it. So during the broadcast, somebody's out there painting on the new lines. I threw Margaret Thatcher's swingometer up here, partly because Margaret Thatcher is considered second really in the 20th century to Winston Churchill, really viewed as a kind of modernizing prime minister from a contemporary point of view. But she also ends up serving 11 years, which is one of the longer terms in British history. But as you see with her swingometer, what's interesting is that it's not just measuring whether Labour is going to gain seats and therefore maintain the government, or what she needs to win with the blue here, but also that there's a wide cone of what's called a hung parliament, when no party gets a majority. And while that's not the end of the world, it's an interesting situation where sometimes smaller parties can get more influence in government because they will pair up with one of the parties to try and form a government. So during her first election, there was actually a wide swath where if the electorate had been, in many cases, a little more balanced in its voting, no government would have won. I show you here the 1992 swingometer, partially because it's not the first time that the swingometer had become digital. But what was interesting about the 92 election was that it was an election that the polls and a lot of people thought was clearly going to either lead to a Labour government or at least a hung parliament, but actually ended up with a very healthy majority for the Conservatives. And the phenomenon was called the shy Tory factor, that people, when they're being polled, weren't being truthful in whether and telling pollsters that they're being honest when they were saying they're voting for another party. And in ways we've heard that also with polling in America in the recent years. But it gives you a nice description of how digital it became. 2010 was the last time that the British government elected a hung parliament. By that time, you can see the digital graphics have exceeded exponentially to the point where you can kind of fill the entire screen up. You can walk around it. You can transpose different maps. Definitely a far cry from the earlier swingometers. But then I also offered. I couldn't find one from the 2019 election, but they had an election in 2017. And here I'm just giving you a sense now, because of the hung parliament and the emergence of new powerful third parties like the Scottish National Party, the swingometers had to adjust to that, in that now you've got multiple swingometers that try to measure party strength in more regional spaces, because the traditional two-party structure doesn't race the same in every place. So in this case, you see here, this swingometer is meant to measure the Conservative Liberal Democrat swing in the seats where that applies, where in a lot of seats it doesn't. So swing has become a very complex thing by which to view things. But what's nice about the swingometer as a mechanism for broadcasting elections is that it provides a constant update, and you're constantly recalculating the average swing. So it gives a way to change the conversation naturally through the night. So if the first election result comes in that it's a 9% swing, well, then you start discussing, well, what's a 9% swing look like in Parliament? And then the next election comes in and it's a swing to the other party of 1%. Well, now you got to average those two. So now you're discussing, oh, well, now it's a 4.5. So it gives a natural kind of roadmap to looking at the election in a real fashion. The downside to using the swingometer in the United States is that whereas in many parliamentary governments, every seat is declared when the voting is over. They don't put out running totals. So you only know the results of an election of a particular seat when the final tally is publicly announced. And then that's when all the votes have been counted. And they could do it rather quickly. They actually have a competition about which constituency can get done counting first. And I'll say two things. Number one is Great Britain uses paper ballots, so the counting is done by hand. And the record, I think, now is 42 minutes between the collection of ballots and the first announcement of results. So it's a rather quick process. But you can't really use the swingometer for running totals like we do because it'll be changing almost every second, and you can't have that analytical part aspect to it. So it really works best if you get declared results 100%, and then you start stacking them on, because once you declare all of them, then that's when you have the true national swing. Okay. Now, in order to do swing, or if you want to think about swing, even in the way you want to present it, you have to create what's called an election or electoral battleground. And the best way and the real important aspect of an electoral battleground is what we call a marginal seat. Now, a marginal seat, by definition, very easily, is just a seat whose previous election result was close. Now, people differ on what they define a marginal seat as. I take the typical definition that a marginal seat is whose margin of victory was 5% or less. And so what that means for swing is, because we have to take half of that seat is susceptible to a 2.5% swing. But some people like to expand the electoral battleground to include seats that are subject to a 5% swing, which would mean a 10% difference between, at the last election, the winner and the loser, as long as they're of the same party or within the same party analysis. Okay, so it's just about why I choose the more typical definition is because it's just kind of statistically more probable that it's reasonable to sway 2.5% of the population than it is to swing 5% of them. But as I'll show you as I work through this, I've taken both into account when I've done this analysis. Now, why are marginal seats important? Well, they really represent the competitive arena. If a majority is going to change, or somebody, let's say it's like the president, somebody's going to win or lose, this is the area where the most likely change is going to occur that can switch the result from last time. It doesn't preclude that nobody, you can't get surprises out somewhere else deeper in what we call much more safe seats. But this is where it's very safe to kind of focus the analysis. These are the seats that are most likely to change sides. Okay. So for a legislative chamber, those would be the seats. In a presidential election, we would just swap the word seat for state. So we can have we don't call them marginal states per se, but we call them swing states. We borrow the terminology a bit, although it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing there. But as I said, the terminology does not exclude that you could have surprises. So here is the 2020 House battleground. Now, if you count all these little squares in it, there's 375. So why are there 375? Well, the reason is that swing measures the change in elections. So we have to establish which election we're going to set as the baseline versus the election we're currently going to have. And swing can only measure change between parties. And if you want to do swing on a large basis, it's best to do it with the two major parties. In our case, most elections are between the Democrats and Republicans. So there's 435 seats in Congress, but only 375 squares here. What about the other 80 or so 60 or so squares? Well, those are seats where either of these conditions are true. One, that the seat was uncontested, and you'd be surprised how many seats go uncontested in Congress. Secondly, and that could be in either or both elections. So if the seat was uncontested in either 2018 or 2020 or both, you can't measure swing. Another consideration is if you do have an electoral competition, but it's not. So this is only set up to measure swing between the Democrats and Republicans. So if a Democrat or Republican is facing an election against somebody from another party or write-in candidates, you can't measure swing between them. So I've excluded them from this analysis because you can't measure two-party swing on this way. Okay, so the conditions what these 375 seats are seats that were contested by a Democrat and Republican in both the 2018 election, congressional election, and the 2020 congressional elections. And why did I pick Congress? Because Congress is up entirely for an election every 2 years. So it allows us to do kind of intermediate analysis. So we don't have to necessarily always use the presidential 4-year or the Senate, which is only up for 1/3 of it every 2 years. So if the House is meant to be the collection of the political cross-section of the country, then that is the most natural place to try to find a national trend. Presidential elections can work to a degree too, but to try to get some real regional variations, because remember, these are House seats, so it can even take into account the various regions within a state, whereas for presidents, it can really only take the state into consideration. So that's the hypothesis, or was my hypothesis for this. Would the swing in the presidential election mirror the swing in the House election? Okay, we'll see how I went with that. And hopefully what we'll learn, especially for the students in here, is, and I'm already foreshadowing, even if your hypothesis isn't confirmed, there's still a lot that we can learn from here. Because what I'm about to go through are things that you probably heard people say, and they are true, but you might not know why, or they might not know why they played out this way. And so this data will be illuminating, at least in that regard. So each square in here represents one of the 375 seats that can be measured for swing between the 2018 and 2020 election. The squares marked in either dark red or dark blue are what we consider safe seats. These are seats where the winner in the 2018 election won so handily, well beyond either measure of 5% majority or 5% swing. Okay, so these are what we consider safe seats. It's very hard to flip a safe seat. Okay, is partly why. Now, you should be surprised. The overwhelming majority of seats in Congress are safe. That means that most likely, if it's held by one part or the other, it has been that way for quite some time. This thing can shift, but you have a lot of safe seats. We're going to focus here on the middle. And I've used a couple different ways to kind of mark this. Now, since the Democrats controlled the Congress after 2018, we have to analyze this as the Republicans trying to win. So we're going to look at what they gain versus what the Democrats can defend. So first off, that's what this X represents. That for the Republicans to win control of Congress, they basically have to win every light blue square up to that X. So the rest of this and up to the X square. It'd be nice if they won seats beyond that, but that's what their goal is. Okay. So that's what that X means. Now, what the light blue and the light pink represent are what we are taking the one definition that I use of a marginal seat. a seat whose swing is within 5%, which makes it 2.5. So that means all the seats from here down through here were susceptible to a 2.5% swing, which is a very reasonable swing where one party can win one election very easily from the other. The darker red and the kind of neon green here are the other definitions. So I decided to mark out how other people define swing, which is that it's susceptible to a 5% swing. So that takes it out in the even further. But still, whatever definition of margin that you have, you're in this tight little box of about 100 seats. Okay. And this yellow border represents what some people call ultra marginal seats. And what the definition of an ultra marginal seat is a seat whose distance at the last election was 2%. So as you see here, only about 8, 11, 14, 17, 19 seats are within 2% of each other. So that's pretty much so. The battleground is really within this frame here. And the most likely battleground is in this box, which means that on first glance, the Republicans cannot regain control of the chamber because even turning all the ultra marginal seats to red still gets them 5 seats short. But using the more that 2.5% swing is totally likely, they have an easy chance of getting it. Okay, so it's in play. So basically, Republicans want to win these seats downwards, and Democrats want to win these seats upwards. So let's look at the effects here. Well, the first thing we know from running the data, and I ran the data for each individual House constituency, the average was 2.69% to the Republicans. And I put my little swingometer here to show you. And my swingometer is adjusted to say that 2.69% swing should have given the Republicans a majority, because that's what this yellow marks out. If this swing were uniform and applied everywhere, the Republicans would have won every light blue seat and the first green seat, which is a tremendous electoral victory considering it's one of these less likely marginal seats. Okay, but we know that didn't happen. Okay, so I'm not trying to overturn the election. That's not what this is about. But just if we took swing by itself, this is what the electoral results should be. But this is what really happened. So on that 2.69% swing to the Republicans, it really only netted the Republicans' victories on a spotty basis, and not enough when offset with the Democratic victories. And you see here, Democrats were able to take not only a safe Republican seat, and I'll explain why in a minute, but also one of these, more stringent marginal seats offset some of the Republicans' victories. So basically, these three offset these 3 victories here. And then when you bunch the rest of them up, they just fell short of an overall taking the majority. Now, I will explain these two. You'll see them again at the end, when I get through here. But part of the reason why this occurred was because North Carolina changed its electoral lines because of a lawsuit rather frequently and in between the 2 elections. So North Carolina, and the way to explain why they get the shifts is probably most due to the change in the congressional lines than it is about necessarily genuine trading of support. They just lumped more Democrats together in this district than in others. But this is the result as it actually happened. Okay, so we'll take that what it is. Now, I want to look at this from a different perspective. Okay, because the 2.69 is an average taken of all of the swing. And the range of this went from -19. So a swing to the Democrats. I used negative and positives in my analysis. So it's swung on one hand in one district 19% to the Democrats, and the other extreme was 34% to the Republicans. Okay, so there's great variance in all of this. Okay, and so because of that variance, I want to give you a sense of what that might look like. So I've taken the seats and now I've recast them in the order of their magnitude of their swing in relation to the average. So in this picture, with that 2.69% swing, every seat that's a shade of red swung to the Republicans, which means that as you look on this, pretty much an overwhelming majority of the seats, even the ones that, if we go back to this picture, were safe Democrat, all face some swing to the Republicans. Okay? Everyone that's light blue saw some swing to the Democrats. Now, why did I color them differently? Well, I decided just to show you the order of magnitude and variance. All the seats in light colors, light red or light blue, are within one standard of deviation from this national average, which shows you that there's a lot of variance in this, which means that some are going to have a 6% swing, while others are going to have a 0.2% swing. So there's a lot of variance in this in this average swing, which it shouldn't be surprising in a country as large as the United States. But I wanted to give you a piece of that in many cases, there was a general swing to the Republicans, even in safe Democratic seats. But I do want to contrast that, but as another mode of analysis, is that if I take the battleground map that I showed you a few seconds ago, that's on the left here, and I map over, because each of these squares represents a district that I can identify. So on my spreadsheet, this is the first cell. It's the one that swung most to the Republicans. This is my 375th cell. And so this is the one that swung most to the Democrats. So I can take the swing list and I can actually take that list, this previous one, and actually tell you which district it happened in. And as you can see, the swings were in some ways where you expect the hardest swings to the Democrats were in safe Republican seats, but they didn't flip, seats, because they were, even with those big turns, it was still a safe Republican. And even here, where you get a big switch to the Republicans, they were in safe Democratic seats, which means these seats were never in danger. But if we look at our little area of analysis here, the real battleground, it's actually a mixed bag. Maybe I should have counted, but just from looking at it, it's about the same number of seats that went to the Democrats, swung to the Democrats, and swung to the Republicans. So a very even battle in the crucial marginal seats. Okay, but that means that even though the Republicans saw overall, from a geographical standpoint, swings in their direction, not enough, nowhere near enough to take control of Congress. Okay. But that's not why you guys are here, because let's face it this way, the House takes second fiddle, especially in a presidential election year, to the presidential election. So let's look at applying the swing to the presidential election. So we've got to start with the presidential battleground. Nice thing here is we get a nice bigger graphic because we're only dealing with 50 blocks instead of 375. But I've done all the same things that I did in the other one. Solid colors are going to be the safe ones. The green and the fuchsia, they're the ones that are defined that are within a 5% swing, therefore a 10% difference in the 20s. And remember, this is in the 2016 election. Okay, that I have to compare this to. The light blue and the light are the more standard definition of swing, and I even boxed in those key 6 states that really became the fulcrum in this. These were the ultra marginals, 2% or less in the difference between them. So for now, in this case, Joe Biden is seeking the presidency, so it's his race to capture. Donald Trump has to defend. So the X goes in a different place here, and that's what the X represents here. Joe Biden only needed to win, in this case, Michigan and Pennsylvania. That's what these 2 blocks represent, to win the presidency. We know that he does better than that, and I'll show you that in a moment. But that's why that X is there. But that also means, and that's what some of these are too, is your Arizonas, your Georgias, all of those ones that fell within here. That's within this yellow box. So these were the seats that could have easily gone either way. So let's start with my hypothesis. Let's start with what would have happened if Donald Trump mirrored the swing that the Republicans got. And if that were true, Donald Trump wins these 3 seats, which means my reckoning, when I counted it, that would have been 338 electoral votes. Okay. Which means he won the presidency quite handily. Now, we know that didn't happen. Okay. So my hypothesis was wrong. And part of it was that I was kind of, this was kind of an idea I'd been floating around, and I just kind of decided to execute it at this moment. So in a way, I'm not disappointed. It's always we get House swing didn't predict this election, but it doesn't mean it might not predict an election again. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. So it doesn't mean that House swing can't be used. It just didn't work in this election. But let's look at what really happened. Well, the first thing is that if you take all the people who voted for president, and that includes the people who voted for their representatives, so all the people included in the House battleground, there was a swing to the Democrats of 1.3% nationwide. And the result of that means is that with that 1.33 swing to the Democrats were able to pick up the states that I marked in blue. So not only Pennsylvania and Michigan, which were essential to get just over the edge, this is where you get Georgia, you get Arizona, you get states like that. So this swing to the Democrats kind of bucked the trend of what was happening with Republicans. Okay. And so what could that say? Well, it could mean a lot of things, but I'm going to give you a sense. Okay. And then I did the same thing here with standard of deviation that I did before, that all of these states were within one standard deviation of the Democratic swing, which shows that there was quite a lot of variance, but with very close to this mean. So that, and that's the list. Whereas if you go back to my map up here, most of the congressional seats went to the Republicans. Well, it was almost opposite with the presidential election. Most, even states that are very red, had a noticeable swing to the Democrats. Okay. So what can I take from this, or what do I take from this? Well, you might have heard the mantra that Donald Trump just wasn't as popular as Republicans. And that might be true, but I think this indicates something much deeper, that I think these trends demonstrate that Trump's unpopularity with established Republicans was very low, and that the people that were showing up to vote for him and then probably would have voted for the Republican congressman as well, thus explaining, the gains there, were not enough to offset the number of Republicans who decided to vote for Joe Biden. So they still voted for their Republican congressman. Plus, Trump voters pulled the vote to 2.69% in the House. But since many Republicans who usually showed up anyway and weren't just showing up for Trump, voted for Biden, pulled that number towards the 1.3. And to give you a sense of that, of how this might be plausible, I'm not saying guaranteed, but plausible, I decided to give you a listing of all of the swing left Republican to the Republicans, right to the Democrats, that were greater than 10% or more, which means that these were overcoming gaps of 20% at least in voting. So the most swung House seat was Connecticut 3, which is around New Haven. So a 34% swing to the Republicans. Now, what you don't notice here is I didn't highlight it in red. A 34% swing was not enough to move the election into the Republican hands. It still stayed in the Democrat. In this list, the Republicans only gained one seat, and that was New York 11. So even with these hard swings to the Republicans, these seats either stayed in the hands, either whether it was a Democrat or a Republican. In the case of Connecticut 3, it was a very well-entrenched Democrat. The Democrats only scored better than 10% in 3 seats. And 2 of them because of redistrict lines. It's recently redistrict lines. So I'm a little wary to say that that's part of just the new demographic. But even in California, in this case, they were keeping a seat already in Democratic hands. It just got wider. But here's what I really want to look at with this. This takes a lot of work because nobody keeps records on what the presidential election result is in each individual district. You have to go and mine this data. So that's why I didn't do it for every House seat. That could be a long-term project, and I'm not doing it now. Hey, look, I could even give it to law and data society students. This could be a big project for you guys. But for the ones that I decided to do, here's what you see. in the same district that saw a 34% swing to the Republican House member or House candidate, because Democrats still won, there was a 2.6% swing to Biden. Same thing here in New York 27, which is right outside of Buffalo. 13.56% swing to the sitting Republican member. In that case, that's why it's not bolded red. It was already a safe Republican seat, a 4.22% swing to Biden. So I think this gives plausibility that Trump voters did show up and could pull these votes and did. They voted along party lines where they did. But because they're ostensibly showing up for Trump, they would have been voting for him. So any way to swing these districts in these drastic ways can only suggest that establishment Republicans voted for Joe Biden. And that's in some ways what happened here. Trump probably was not very popular within the Republican Party, but had a very vocal group of people who in many ways either were Republicans or people who just kind of got onto the cause. But I open up the idea that, this is just my interpretation of the data, and there can be several other explanations. So I probably went way over the time I expected to go with that. But I welcome any questions or comments that anybody would like to have.
Henry, excellent presentation. I have a slew of questions, but I want to open it up to anyone that's here, the attendees. If you would like to unmute yourself or pose your question in the chat. We plan to run to 3:00 today, which gives us about 13 minutes. But we can go just a couple of minutes more, given how much ground that Henry covered today. So do you have any questions? Are there any questions? Yes, Jackie.
I'm sorry. If I could just steal 2 minutes to this, I know everybody who has attended here, and the students who are here are the students in my International Political Economy course. Hi, Ellen. Thank you. And they're going to be wondering how all of this relates to our class. So if I can just, like I said, have a minute and a half to mention a couple of the concepts in our class and to show how some really interesting things were said here. I think it might be really helpful for the students, and then I'll just back up and let everybody else talk. But in our class, we're talking about approaches to understanding the international political economy, but they mirror what happens in the domestic context. We have classical economic liberalism, the basic free market approach to the economy. The U.S. is on the far end of practicing that kind of approach in its economy. And we just learned how in the 20th or 21st century had kind of a split where you've had some members who would go along with economic liberalism, favoring a more interventionist approach in the state, and others who would follow with the Chicago school, who would just be an orthodox liberal and say, nah, very little intervention in the state. This is a result of economic crises and people being concerned about the split is about the banks basically maybe causing financial crises. So mirroring 1998 and then 2008, those two economic crises. But then with Donald Trump and around the world, you've had a rise of populism, which accords to our mercantilism or neo-mercantilist approach. And here, it's an interventionist approach, but it's very much in favor of strengthening the state, not trying to make the markets work better necessarily, but make the markets better in terms of an efficiency and everybody wins outcome, but rather better for the state, for the country. So make America great again. Trump was very consistent about, he wanted to see economic policies that favored the United States, and it was a real change. What I think is interesting from what you showed, Henry, was exactly something you mentioned in your conclusion, which is the Republican Party was really split. You had some folks who bought Trump's approach, and yet you still had traditional Republicans who were, more in the orthodox liberal approach, keep government, from really being very interventionist in the economy. And your last slide, where you showed really strong majorities in House votes, and yet some of them swung to Biden, that's because it wasn't really about economics. Usually, or at least this is my understanding, and I'll step back to the wiser heads in the virtual room here. But yeah, exactly this. A lot of folks voted for Biden, not over an economic issue, but over the handling of the coronavirus. That was what at least some of the polls showed. And so, because many of the conventional Republicans, even though they were holding their nose and following Trump, right? So pretty interesting. I also want to mention that we do have a student in the room who is not from the US, so is not used to presidential systems. And to that student, I want to say, the vote for the president is completely different. It's a different actual vote, and it's not tied to the results in our legislature, although the two parties often try to work together or work, across the executive and the legislative branch to get all of their candidates elected. But it's not like a parliamentary system where the leader of the winning party is also then becomes your prime minister. Of course, we don't have that system here. As I always like to say, that would leave Nancy Pelosi as our chief executive in the US if we had a parliamentary system, but we don't. So anyway, so just wanted to mention that, and thank you for giving me a floor to help my students relate to what was presented.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank all of you for coming. That's fantastic. Henry, I just had a comment, and I wanted others to pose a question before we close today. I think that your main conclusion about the use of the swing in its implications, right, to thinking about President Trump, and particularly President Trump's incumbency and President Trump's coattail advantage, right? That in any given election, it's for an incumbent president, we are looking for proxies, right, to measure the coattail effects, right? We're looking to see how strong is this president, this sitting president, and how does it relate to the other factors, and in turn other offices, right? So I think that your conclusion is very valid, right? It's just about can the House swing be used as a measure? There's certainly not causation there, but certainly could be used as a proxy, right, to be dictating about and predicting election returns. But as we know, the interesting part of this is that there are so many factors that matter, right? There's Jackie mentioned the economy, and then there are these other things that may draw people to the polls. They vote for the president, and they vote for their other representatives, including Congress. And that's the part, folks, that are in this room that is really difficult to square away, because we're trying to think about how much one part of it matters, right? And if how one votes and the political party one votes for the representative in Congress carries forward to the presidential election, and then back and forth, and then how it relates to representation. So very interesting. I have a lot more things to say, but I wanted to open up to questions. I just wanted to comment, though, Henry, that I think that it was a really reasonable conclusion, and we seek out more explanations, on why that could have been. So,
well, I'm glad you brought up President Coattails, because you probably learned, undergrad poli sci like I did. we just took the concept as is. Like we were told this is what president coattails are, but we never were able to quantify it. And I never really thought about until you said that whether this could be a means by which to start getting a quantifiable way of doing it. Like I'll say for like what David Butler would have done with these results. You know, if I just pop this back up real fast, is he would then say, okay, he knew what the national swing was in the House. Okay, these are certain. I'm just going to use these data points because I have them. But if you notice, even in some cases, like even New York 11, it was a swing to the Republican 11.13, but only 6% to Trump. So there was still almost half that didn't go to Trump. So he would be, and all those factors you're saying is his next step would be that he would call on political scientists to go study what other things played out in that district. Because in all, and this is where his theory goes, fine, 2.69 is the national swing. So if anybody didn't get 2.69, there's a mixture of local and regional issues that account for changing that. And that's what we can look at by identifying this. So was it, like what we do in other ways, was it the economy in this part, but in this way, it does it down to each district. So that's what he would have done with something like this as an extended analysis.
I think some of the political science models in American politics have started to capture that. They certainly have quantified the coattail effect, which I think that in your presentation, though, this that I don't know about this is the extent that swing itself is used as the independent variable. Right, because there
I'm trying to make it so.
Yeah, it seems that way, and I think that there are other things with, of course, the economy, political strength, polarization, among other things that you put them as acting as independent variables, and then really just as a measure of presidential approval for public opinion. But it's interesting, though, when you think about the geographical part of this, right? It's in the districts, in particular geographies, but it also makes you think about those other things, though, about how this changes with other political institutions, such as what happens when these districts are reapportioned. So that's the question I have for 2022: is that what is this going to look like? You mentioned the gerrymandering piece of this, which one of the how have these lines been drawn to be safe, and which ones may enter the battlegrounds, and which ones aren't. And then, of course, it's this big X factor about political polarization that's here today, right? That there are so many more solid districts there, and how does that account over time? So part of this, the discipline, I'm talking about political science. Apologies, say the discipline, right? Political science, I think, does account for a good part of it. But it's always about what does it mean today, because it's always reshaping about the implications are different for every election. And this is certainly 2020 is one that's going to be studied for a very long time. And we're just getting to scratch the surface on what we think happened here.
Well, what I'll say is that this election might be an anomaly, because by those swings in the House, some of those seats became instantly not marginal anymore just by that result. And that might not be so. It just could be a one-off. And that's the thing. Like, as well as I do, like the only way to really see this is when we study it over successive elections. And then we can we can see that. And that's part of the challenge of examining this election as a first run, right? Is this could just be a Trumpish, populist effect that, it'll correct itself. So the next election will look really bold, but maybe that was the way it was always going to be if you didn't have this anomaly in between. But the other thing I'll say, what you said about the other models, but I think about like Nate Silver, because he's well known, and he's got a popular audience, but he holds his model as a proprietary secret in a lot of cases. What I like about using swing is it's a very simple formula that anybody can use to do this analysis. It's very straightforward. It's not perfect, but that's what's nice about the Butler swing, is that it's very simplistic in its use.
Okay, I wanted to enter a speed round of questions, but let me make sure to check the attendees. Are there any questions for on the floor before we start to close out our session today? Any questions? Okay, very good. There's a comment from Dr. Reich here. Excellent.
Again, it's on my.
That's a dissertation, not a comment. I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
that's again putting it in the language of my class. But I just think that this was such an unusual election. I think your hypothesis was really reasonable, Professor Buhner. But we had this odd split among Republicans, okay, or orthodox economic liberals versus Trump and his populist mercantilist wing, who were dragging away the traditional blue dog Democrats, right? And pulling them into, along with the far right of the Republican Party. That was the base, right, that he was appealing to. And then the whole coronavirus thing, the management of that was a big election issue. So those were what voters were always talking about is, what were the major issues? And I'm throwing immigration in as an economic issue fundamentally, although I know it has great cultural aspects to it. And we're not even talking about people who just hated Trump's, inability to be, trying to pick my words carefully, to accepted facts and understandings of issues. So that also, but many of the Republicans were willing to overlook that factor. So that's why I'm tossing it aside. But I think your hypothesis would work in most other elections.
Only time will tell if I want to keep going with it.
Very good. Dr. Reich, thank you. Let's close with this question, Henry, and we'll close the session for today. I want to thank everyone for coming. This has been such an enlightening talk today on the 2020 election, this idea of swing. So let's bring it back to the idea of the House. And I have one question. From what we saw today, did the Democrats underperform?
If we take what I'm saying is that Trump pulled people in, I can't put the onus on them for losing the seats that they did. Yeah, they might have been enough to bring in enough seats to make them lose somewhat of their majority. When we see how things go without Trump in office, in the 2022 midterms. But then again, the one trouble you have with the 2020 midterms is midterms are usually a swing against the government. So again, it might be even hard to tell, but I think my numbers suggest that the Democrats couldn't underperform because they weren't going to win the voters that pulled that number to 2.69.
Very good. Very good. Well, that's a great way to end it. If we kept going from there, we will talk another 3 hours. Okay. Let's all give a round of applause to Dr. Buhner for his colloquium today.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic talk.
Being willing to listen to me for 45 minutes is
yes,
enough of an ordeal.
We have recorded the session today for so those can't make it, that we're going to work and put it up online because there was some really insightful things. So thank you everyone for coming. Dr. Buhner, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
And I wish all of you a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Take care.